Ever feel like everything's getting more expensive? Groceries, rent, even breathing. And let's not forget car insurance. It just keeps creeping up. But here's the thing. Insurify makes one part of life easier. It's an insurance comparison site that finds real-time quotes from dozens of top insurers. Insurance companies compete for your business, driving down prices. It's like having a friend who knows all the best deals, but without the smug grin. You could save as much as $1,025 a year, and you might even cut your bill in half. The best part, it's all online. No phone calls, no spam, no nonsense. You can be covered in as little as 10 minutes, and with an excellent star rating on Trustpilot, saving feels less impossible. So why not give it a shot? Visit Insurify.com and see how much you can save. That's INSURIFY.com. Average potential savings based on initial quotes received by 183,234 customers seeking insurance through Insurify. Actual savings may vary depending on state of residence, individual circumstances, coverage selections, and insurance provider. Savings results are not guaranteed.
This show is sponsored by Liquid IV. Like many people, I've come into the new year full of hopes and aspirations for the next 12 months. Maybe, like me, you're anxiously pacing the floor waiting for the F1 season to begin, or perhaps you've set yourself a more regular fitness goal, like running your first marathon or commuting to work by bike. Whatever you plan to do in 2025, come into your own way with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Powered by Live Hydroscience, Liquid IV helps you break the mould. Liquid IV is so easy and convenient to tear, pour and enjoy, and it comes in several fantastic flavours, like their new Hydration Multiplier Sugar-Free Raspberry Lemonade, and other winners like White Peach and Rainbow Sherbet. As a regular flyer, I know how easy it is to become dehydrated, almost without knowing it, when you're travelling. That's why I always take Liquid IV on overseas trips. It's more than just a drink, and it's scientifically formulated to hydrate better than water alone. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water provides 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 essential vitamins and nutrients. And what's more, it's always non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free and soy-free. Embrace your ritual with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code THERACE at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code THERACE at liquidiv.com.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and even before the season has started, there's already a technical controversy with the FIA issuing a technical directive curbing flexi-wings. But why will this only kick in after 8 races, and what impact could it have on the leading teams? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to reveal all are Mark Hughes and John Noble. Well, John, we'll come to you first. This is your first tech controversy since you joined the race. Hasn't taken long.
No, I love a good tech controversy. They are, some people kind of brush over them and don't get too excited about them. But I always think they're really, really important because they matter to teams. It's all small details. And what's also always intriguing about tech controversies, there's always hidden elements and secret elements. And a lot of this operates in a world that isn't in public. So these are technical directives that the FIA issue, which aren't actually in the rule book. They're not published. They're the FIA's interpretation of regulations. We often don't know when they're sent or how many they're sent out, or what they say, but sometimes we get hold of them, sometimes we see them, sometimes they're updated, and this was a TD18, so it's quite an old one, but it's been revamped and has caused a bit of a stir.
Absolutely. It's very much the smoke-filled rooms. And you're right, tech controversies, it's not just about the technical stuff, because there's a political angle we'll talk about, there's a sporting angle, as well as just the pure technical side of it. So these are always good, aren't they, Mark? There've been plenty of those over the past few years, so I say few years, past many years that you've been covering F1.
Yes, and they do reveal the competitive intensity within the sport, and quite often they reveal explanations, better explanations for what we've already witnessed in the past. And this is one of those, as we'll get into in a minute.
Absolutely. Well, we will get into it right now. And Mark, perhaps you can run us through the basics, because the FIA has issued a technical directive. Can you just outline what it says and what it means teams are or are not allowed to do?
The TD specifies a 1mm reduction at the permitted flex at the most inboard of the 3 measuring points, so down from 3mm to 2mm. At the most outboard end of the measuring points, this should translate from a 15mm permitted flex down to 10mm. So you can imagine that the wings are stiff in the middle, but it can flex downwards when load is applied. So it's a 1/3 increase in vertical stiffness that is being regulated in. And this is all flex resulting from a 1,000 Newton load being applied at the defined measuring points. So the 1,000 Newton load is not changed, because that's as high a load as the FIA can safely go if you're measuring it in a garage at the track and not in a sealed off dyno room with no people in it. So the only way of tightening the test further is effectively to reduce the permitted flex at the prescribed load, because you're limited in how much load you can safely apply statically. But the loads generated by the cars, once past 100, 120 miles an hour, are substantially greater than 1,000 newtons. So that's where the window of opportunity has arisen. You can get the wing to pass the stationary load tests, but design them in a way which then allows them to flex more than that at high speed. And what changed with McLaren's Miami update, and subsequently was adopted by Mercedes a few races later and also by Alpine at the end of the year, was a new flex geometry which allowed much greater flex than before at those high speeds. So everyone's wings were always flexing more than the static limit once they got up to 100, 120 miles an hour. But with the new flex geometry McLaren had, they were able to get much more flex, much more than further beyond the static limit. The flex geometry is just about the layup of the carbon fiber to generate the shape change you're going to get as the load increases. But bear in mind that the load increases with the square of the speed. It's not just arithmetical. So you have the physical geometry of the wing, what it looks like stationary, and the geometry that results under increasing load. And so working at the outer edges of structural design knowledge, McLaren made a step change in how to do that internal flex geometry, one which took a lot of research and resource and would have been very expensive. The reason why this was so valuable in 2024 in particular was because the teams had all found themselves in a bit of an aerodynamic bottleneck as they became ever better at running the cars super low without introducing bouncing. And previously that bouncing threshold defined the limit of how low you could go, and obviously the lower you can go, the more downforce the underbody creates. But into 24, with the improved knowledge of how to keep the bouncing at bay, the underbody was creating an aero map which really exaggerated the natural trait of understeer at low speeds and oversteer at high. And the more you attack one problem, the worse the other becomes. And the bigger the spread of corner speeds at a track, the bigger the problem this balance conflict became between low and high speed. So basically, with the downforce balance between front and rear generated by the floor at these new super low ride heights, the front wing wasn't powerful enough at low speed and was too powerful at high speed. So increasing the amount of flex at high speed, thereby depowering the front wing relative to the rear as the speed increased, was suddenly worth way more lap time than had been the case when bouncing was the limitation. Hence how suddenly McLaren's Miami update made it the fastest car, and cue all the stupid conspiracy theories about Red Bull having been denied some form of trick in secret. Total rubbish. The actual story was far more interesting, and it was about this flex geometry. So the new directive, it won't stop the wing from flexing way beyond those static measurements. It still will. But it will obviously reduce it, because to pass the more stringent static test means it will be flexing less, and therefore it'll be flexing less at high speed too. But it will still be going way beyond the static limit. So you'll still see the wings bending downwards at high speed from onboard cameras, just not as much. But who knows how much potential there is for yet another innovation in structural design and those internal carbon layups to get where they were before, even with the stricter static test. I'd bet money that we'll still be able to reproduce most, if not all of that effect, very quickly.
Absolutely. It's always the way in Formula One. And of course, if anyone's wondering why you allow any kind of flexibility, well, it's not just that it's impossible to test the real world conditions. It's also that there has to be some kind of flexibility, even though there is a regulation that says it's got to be rigid. If it's completely rigid, then it's just going to break. So that's not practical. And it's worth underlining this TD18, which it's a new issue of rather than a completely fresh issue, but they often update quite comprehensively technical directives, applies to the front wing because the rear wing was dealt with last year with some regulations on how much the slot gap can open up, etc. But John, I guess the question everyone's going to want to know is who's the winner and loser out of this? Who's going to win the championship because of it? Who's going to dominate the first part of the season, then slump after the first 8 races when it kicks in?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one because when the TD first came out, you thought, oh, wow, this is going to have to hurt McLaren and Mercedes because these are the two teams that got a head start on the others. Ferrari and Red Bull had lobbied against what McLaren and Mercedes were doing. They pushed the FIA to try to change the rules last year or increase the tests. And the FIA began investigations from Belgium, looked into it, but throughout the end of last year, said, no, we're happy. We don't think anything's untoward. We'll keep things static. Ferrari jumped on the bandwagon towards the end of last year and by Austin got its flexi-wing working and was winning races again. Red Bull much later to the party, but it's been pushing on to this season. So at first hand, you'd think, well, surely this is, Red Bull have won and we're going to slow McLaren and Mercedes down. But those two teams are actually quite comfortable with what's done. Then there was an alternative conspiracy theory that popped up that actually said this is actually McLaren's doing, that it realised Red Bull was going to make massive gains. I think there's some indications that Christian Horner had said in F1 commission meetings that, we're going to unleash really, really aggressive flexi-wings, are going to take things to extremes. And McLaren got wind of this, pushed for the change, rolled it back and have basically wrecked Red Bull's plans. So actually, was this a McLaren win? I think the truth's probably somewhere in the middle, that Red Bull have wanted this change. They think they came close to it last year. It didn't happen for unspecified reasons. So at least they've reined back how aggressive people can be, and the ceiling's now been set, so it'll be easier to catch up. And from McLaren's perspective, no one else can overtake it. No one else can be more aggressive with it. And I think we also have to remember that, McLaren has the mastermind of flexi-wings, Rob Marshall, basically. He was at Red Bull for a long while. He worked a lot there on these designs. I remember chatting to Christian Horner last year, and he said, Rob would come into the office on a Monday morning with Meccano sets and papier-mâché mock-ups of wings and would sit on the design desk and say, look, we can make this flex and do this and all this sort of thing. 9 out of 10 times those ideas didn't get progress because they knew they'd be picked up by the FIA, but occasionally those ideas did get through, like Mini DRS last year, flex on the rear wing, clever design. So McLaren, they'll know what the limits are. They'll know where the advantages are. They'll know where everything is. I still think they will have an advantage because they understand the game at play. But it's definitely leveled the playing field, and I think it's given everyone a lower ceiling to target to potentially close things up.
Yeah, it's great. There's this constant dance that goes on when it comes to flexi-wings. How hard do you want to push it? How far do you think you can? Obviously, Red Bull felt they'd been clamped down on before, so weren't willing to go as far as Mercedes and McLaren did, so they felt it was a little bit unfair. So, yeah, you always get this constantly goes on, the battle over what you can and cannot do with the flexi-wings.
This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. While MeUndies can't totally help your love life this Valentine's Day, they can offer you insanely comfy undies and loungewear to buy or gift. MeUndies has so many awesome Valentine's Day prints and styles. Plus, you can match with your partner, friends, or even your pets. This Valentine's Day, give the gift that'll keep them thinking of you and score huge site-wide savings at MeUndies.com/Spotify. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify. MeUndies. Comfort from the outside in.
Hey everybody, it's Diana Rossini from the Scoop City Podcast. It's Super Bowl week and the eyes of the world are on New Orleans to see if the Chiefs can make history or if the Eagles are ready to rain on their parade. Myself, Robert Mays, Derek Clausen, and a whole host of NFL reporters and special guests will be live streaming every day from Radio Row, covering all the build-up to Sunday's showdown. Join us on the Athletic HQ YouTube account every day at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. It's not to be missed.
Well, John, let's look a little bit more at the bigger picture. I remember sitting with Nicholas Tombassis last year, and he said there wouldn't be any changes to permitted flexibility in 2025 beyond what they'd implemented during the year in terms of the rear wings. Focus was instead going to be on 26. So why have things changed? What's the political angle here?
There's got to have been some lobbying in the background. We're not privy to what's happened. I'm told this was discussed in TAC, which is the Technical Advisory Committee. This is the teams and the FIA. This was mentioned over the winter, and discussions were pushed forward. So the teams knew something was coming, the scope of which and the timing to be decided. So this is something that's been coming for a while. There's also an interesting, backstory. I'm not sure how much of this is, true and has been kind of retrospectively fitted, but I was told that there were indications from the FIA at the Singapore Grand Prix last year that the FIA was going to act. It was going to impose a bit of a clampdown, stop things getting out of control. Teams like, Red Bull and Ferrari were assured something was happening, so they didn't push on. And then suddenly it fell by the wayside. Now, one cynic suggested to me that this coincides actually that weekend with Max Verstappen and the press conference and the swearing and all the hoo-ha with the FIA. And, could you link those two elements together? I mean, that's a wild conspiracy theory, but, stranger things have happened in Formula One that, motivations and kind of loyalties shift around. This is part of the political battle. Teams are pushing the FIA to do things to cost their rivals. So somewhere in the mix of what's happened over the winter, whether it's TAC, whether it's private lobbying, someone's pushed for change to slow things down. I think all the teams are looking at somebody else, thinking they've done it. And this never happens in Formula One. No team's going to put their hand up and say, oh, we've been completely nobbled and this has totally wrecked our championship. But I think that the situation will become clear from Spain when we see what the actual shuffling around is.
And Mark, a phrase you like to use and have used many times on this podcast is competitive paranoia. So how much of all of this controversy in the politics is competitive paranoia that's not necessarily based in facts, and how much is there something real and substantive going on here? Does Red Bull have any reason to be suspicious? Do any of the other teams have any justification to, or is it just all sort of tilting at windmills, being scared of shadows because they're so convinced something must be going on, they're almost looking for it?
I think all the teams are always justified in having competitive paranoia because, the saying, just because they're paranoid doesn't mean they're not trying to get you. I think that is the standard default mindset when you're competing at this level. And how realistic those fears are can't be known, which is what makes them more fearful. And so it's something that, a few races down the line, you can have the outcome of, there, you see, I told you, or, oh, yeah, that was nothing. We're worried about nothing, weren't we? So, it's between those two barriers, if you like. So, as Johnny said, it's going to be interesting monitoring how much, if anything, things change in the competitive order and the gaps between the teams from Spain onwards.
The great example, John, isn't it? You mentioned Rob Marshall earlier, and there was very much when McLaren did their flexi-wings last year, people in Red Bull thinking, oh, that's Rob Marshall, isn't it? Yeah, he used to do that sort of thing for us. So it just shows how everyone tries to push the limits as far as they can. But do you see this as the end of not necessarily the flexi debate, but flexi changes in 25? Do you think the FIA said, right, we're imposing this is coming in for race 9, we're not going to do anything else this year? Or do you think there's going to continue to be chatter going on and potential further tweaks to try and curb whatever people may or may not be doing?
I think it won't stop because there is a huge competitive advantage, as Mark's well explained. This current generation of cars have this inherent problem characteristic of low speed understeer and high speed oversteer, and teams are constantly battling against this. The best solution to get rid of this, they found, are flexi-wings. If you lose that ability completely, then you're going to be stuck with a very uncompetitive car that's not very well balanced. Tyres go off, drivers aren't confident. So teams are going to need to push to the limit. They're going to need to make sure that they hit that tolerance limit of 10 millimeters exactly, because anything less will be a problem. And then I think it's how do teams achieve it? What are going to be the tricks to increasing the balance? What are going to be the elements they need to push on? Because it's also an arena. You can't test this kind of the balancing and the risks of bouncing and porpoising in a wind tunnel. It's impossible. So you've got to get out there on track and realise it. And I think this is the problem we're going to face. Because as Ferrari, found at the Spanish Grand Prix last year when they bought their upgrade, everything looked hunky-dory with a floor, for example, in the wind tunnel and the CFD. Big bouncing came back. So it's a track that can expose problems at kind of high speed, the low ride heights, you get the bouncing, you get the porpoising. So it could open up a world of pain for the teams. that we can't predict and they can't predict, and they're all going to, have potentially a brutal wake-up call on the Friday in Barcelona.
And to come back to the testing, Mark, as you talked about earlier, it's not possible to do static tests that simulate the loads on track, but I guess people would quite like to know why that's the case. Why is it so difficult to be more rigorous in this? Why does there have to be such a big grey area? Because it's probably fair to say this is the biggest grey area in the rules, because it just fundamentally exists, doesn't it? Because you've got the two measures, you've got the absolute, it's got to be rigid, and then you've got the actual load tests that define whether you're living up to that rigidity within what they define as testable and acceptable.
Yeah, the rigidity is just there to give them a tool to control it with. As you say, it can't be rigid because it would just snap. And it's like the wings of a plane flap about when you look out the window, and if they didn't do that, you would the wings would snap and you'd fall out of the sky. So they flex by definition when you put load on them, and they have to. But it's just how much load, and so there are only two ways of doing it. There are only two components to testing it, and one's to how much load you apply, and the other's how much flexibility you allow at that load. So as we said, they've reduced the amount of flexibility you're allowed whilst keeping the load the same, and they can't go higher with the load because it's just it's tested in the garage at the track with people there. So once you get into the squaring loads that you get with speed, it would have to be so extreme that the loads that you're putting on, it would no longer be safe. You would need to have a special dyno room like where you test the engines. With no people in it, and you're sitting in a cabin with sort of bulletproof glass, which that's not really practical to take to every track. So the easiest way of doing it is just to keep the load the same at a safe level, knowing that the cars create more than that, but controlling it through how much flex you're allowed. So that's it. It's just a question of practicality.
The other complication they've got in trying to formulate something to test this properly is that not all the wings are behaving in the same way. In the past, one of the benefits of flexi-wings was just to rotate the end plate back, basically, so the flap was lesser. But the wings these days, I think Fred Vasseur, when Mark and I were speaking to him last year, referred to them as Mohican wings because they're folding down at the edges. We've got end plates that are rotating backwards and forwards. All the characteristics are different. The complications and technology that teams are implementing to achieve their aims are so complex that there's no way you can come up with a set regulation that's going to prevent everything they do. And I'm sure, there'll be engineers and designers examining these regulations now to work out, is there a way we can pass this static test but still try and achieve a lot of the aims through, wing rotation or changing some element of this front wing to end up delivering our aim. Because once you understand the benefit that's there, you've got to work out a way to achieve it. Because you're not just going to leave, performance on the table just because the regulations try to haul you back.
Yeah, and people will characterise some of these things as cheating, but it isn't. It is what the game is. It's a bit like last year when McLaren had the rear wing. People say, they cheated for a few races. They didn't. The FIA knew what they were doing. They said, yeah, you're fine with it. Then the FIA said, actually, we want to knock this back a bit. And McLaren did. And in fact, McLaren said they offered to dial it back a little bit in the spirit of cooperation, of course, having had it for 3 of the tracks where it was most valuable. So that is the game. There is a strategy there, and it's just not as simple as this, are people cheating or whatever. You could say it's bending the rules because bending fits in quite well with it. But I guess, Mark, you could argue that if you can't test it properly, you could say, is there a case for just removing the flexibility requirement and say, well, as long as your car can be safe and strong enough and you're not going to have failures, because obviously that was the original reason why you don't want flexible bodywork, because if something flexes, there'll be a breaking point eventually, and if you have a wing going at an opportune moment, that can be a huge crash. So with the cost cap there to govern it, to play devil's advocate, is there a case for just removing it and say, yeah, do what you want as long as it's safe? And if you say that, is there a way to measure it's safe other than sending drivers out to be crash test dummies and seeing if they crash?
I think the teams have got good enough simulation now that they could reproduce it to make it quite safe. But I think the problem you have is the expense and the resource it costs to do it well. And this introduces a competitive element. You only have the required level of resource in some of the teams. You only have the required level of knowledge in some of the teams. So if you did that, you are introducing a have and have-nots, and you're widening the gap between the fastest cars and the slow cars. So I think it's more to do with that, really, that the FIA is clamping down on it. I think it was concerned that, if a team, as able as Red Bull is looking at it and saying that's going to cost us way too much to research and implement properly, and it's going to take us over the cost cap, then what does a Haas do? One of the little teams. What does a Sauber do? I think it would just increase the lap time difference between the fast cars and the slow ones.
Yeah, I think the flexi bodywork dance is going to go on for a good while yet. Okay, Mark, well, let's look at the impact of the TD in terms of this year. Gary Anderson, our technical expert, argued it splits the year effectively into one 8-race block. Then you have the change, and there's a 16-race block after the change. Could it lead potentially to a wild swing? And might it, as Gary argues, distort the championship because the goalposts do suddenly move and people can allocate resources in different ways? You could, in an extreme case, have someone winning the first 8 races, then suddenly slumping back to 4th fastest car. It's never quite that dramatic, but could we see something of that ilk?
Yeah, I don't think it'll be wild, but you may well do. I mean, we saw how relatively dramatic McLaren's form was when it introduced this technology in Miami. It went from 4th quickest car, albeit quite, not far behind, to the quickest car. So yeah, I mean, it's possible. It's heading in the unknown though, because there's so many moving parts to it. I would say those teams which had already embarked on this course will have a more detailed knowledge, which Johnny was alluding to before. And that will probably give them a head start in developing flexi-wings, which meet the tighter tests statically, but flex as required at high speed. So, but, maybe the new test really will bring the technology up against a hard limit that no amount of clever structural geometry can get around. In which case, it would limit the advantage found by the flexi-wing teams and therefore help Ferrari and Red Bull, who didn't go down this route, not last year at any rate. So you'd then think, well, the old allowance is still in play for 9 races. That's a big chunk of the season. So Ferrari and Red Bull surely aren't going to just ignore the opportunity presented by those 9 races. So surely they'll have McLaren-style flexi-wings too for those 9 races. And how will they be able to get straight up to speed with that, or will it take them a few? So there's so many moving parts. It's impossible to predict what the outcome is going to be.
I think what's also important to say is that the fight at the front is so close and has been so close last year that you don't need much of a difference at all to actually make a big change. When you look at Mini DRS, McLaren argued its performance was almost kind of negligible. You're talking about 1 or 2 kilometers and a tiny amount of lap time. But in a race like Baku, it made all the difference.
Yeah,
because
it won them that race.
If Leclerc had 2 more meters of straight line benefit into turn 1, he would have got past Piastri. But Piastri was able to hold on by the skin of his teeth, had just enough top speed. So it did make the difference. And you don't need very much top speed. You don't need very much extra balance or lap time to actually be the difference between winning races and finishing second. So, some teams are like, this isn't a game changer. It's not going to cost us half a second, but it doesn't need to. If it costs you half a tenth, for example, that can be the difference between pole position and second on the grid. It can be the difference between winning a race and finishing seconds.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the kind of gaps we're expecting to be dealing with this year. And yeah, it is an unusual scenario, I guess, Mark. It's the 9th race that the new things kick in for. So you get 8 races under the current interpretation, then the reigning change. Obviously, the principle of a rule change during the year isn't ideal, but while on principle it would be nice if the regs were there for all of the year, we have to accept that with the way this has been discussed, when it's come in, the development programs, and of course teams have known this was coming for a while, so it's not just been dropped on them this week. I guess it was, although a bit unsatisfactory, it's pragmatic that it did have to come in some point around that area of the year. And we should say the FIA initially wanted to do it a couple of races earlier, kind of around Imola time, but it's ended up settling on Spain. Is that just the nature of the beast, or is it a painful distortion of the regs, a moving of the goalposts?
I think it was just practical. I think, there's so many different agendas and wishes that this is the best compromise. There'll be smaller teams who would have wanted it imposed from race one, I'm sure, and other teams who will have wanted to just let it go for this season because we've got a new formula coming in 26. This is just some way of alleviating, acknowledging both sets of concerns. Really, it's similar going back a long time to when traction control was the FIA had given up on trying to police it and said, okay, from Spain, everyone can have it. And there was the suspicion at the time that Ferrari had it and nobody else did, and that all of a sudden everybody would be, much closer to Ferrari or even beating Ferrari, and actually they were further away than had ever been. So it's no telling. But it's not unprecedented that they do a change partway through the season and the teams have to plan for it.
Yeah, it was Spain in 2007, wasn't it, that changed? But again, there was a lot of talk about that. And it's rare that something like this completely transforms everything, isn't it, John? It will be part of the tapestry. And when we get to the end of the year, I'm sure there'll be a significance in it. And you may see some trends, but this TD isn't probably going to have just like that switched the destiny of the championship or anything like that, even though whoever ends up on the wrong side of it might decide it is.
Well, but you never know, do you? If a team dominates those first 8 races because it's exploited it well beyond the limits of what are allowed, and then suddenly it drops back by half a tenth, and those wins turn into second places and things turn around, then it could change things. I think it depends how close things are at the front, and it depends on the complications that are caused with your car design, because these cars have to work well together. They've got to operate through the speed range, a ride height range, got to be good balanced. The teams are constantly battling the quest for more downforce versus usable downforce, getting the car into a good operating window. So all these elements come together, and I think we can't tell the impact. It could be that one of those top 4 teams is well clear at the front with a design that doesn't make as much use of flexi-wings as somebody else, and actually the change for Spain helps them even more, and they pull even more clear. But we can't tell the impact yet, but it doesn't take much to change things in Formula One, especially if things are as close this year as they were last season.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's worth noting as well, if you're adapting a car for the change, it's not just a case of you change the wing, because it'll impact the whole aero map of the car. So you'll have to make downstream changes as well, which is going to make the Spain upgrades, which I'm sure we'll see, particularly interesting. It just shows in the season where we're talking about the focus switching to 26 development, there's still going to be loads to talk about technically, and we're going to see some performance swings. So yeah, the development battle has started early with this flexi-wing news, and no doubt there'll be plenty more flexi-wing chat in the season. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.